Protesters have taken to the streets Tuesday in a national day of disruption, blocking major roads and highways as well as Ben Gurion International Airport. This following the Knesset's approval of the first reading of the reasonableness standard bill overnight. ILTV's Lidar Gravelazi has the story.
כן, להלן תוצאות ההצבעה, 64 בעד, 56 נגד. אני קובע כי הצעת חוק יסוד השפיטה, תיקון מספר 5, עילת הסבירות, התקבלה ותועבר לוועדת החוקה, חוק ומשפט.
The Knesset in the early hours of Tuesday voted to pass the reasonableness standard bill, part of the scaled-back legal reform that would limit the court's ability to use reasonableness to evaluate parliamentary decisions. Following the vote, protesters took to the streets Tuesday in a national day of disruption. Major roads and intersections around the country were blocked from the early hours of Tuesday, culminating in a protest at Ben Gurion International Airport. Meanwhile, ahead of the day of protest, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu released a video urging restraint and explaining that the proposed bill would not harm Israeli democracy, but rather strengthen it.
גם לאחר התיקון, עצמאות בית המשפט וזכויות האזרח בישראל לא ייפגעו בשום צורה. בית המשפט ימשיך לפקח על חוקיות הפעילות והמינויים של הממשלה. הממשלה והשרים לא יוכלו לשקול שיקולים זרים, לפעול בניגוד עניינים או למנות מינויים לא כשירים. להפך, תחת פיקוח בית המשפט שיימשך. הממשלה תהיה חייבת לפעול בתום לב, במידתיות, בהגינות ובשוויון. ולכן סבירות סולברג היא לא קץ הדמוקרטיה, אלא חיזוק הדמוקרטיה. והיא בוודאי, לא סיבה לקרוא לסרבנות או לשבש את חייהם של מיליוני אזרחים.
The Reasonableness Standards Bill has now moved on to the Knesset Constitution Law and Justice Committee, after which it will need to return to the Knesset plenum for its final second and third readings before passing into law.
It has not only been an action-filled day today, but also an interesting week, as there is never a dull moment here in the Middle East. And so, joining us now with an in-depth look into this week's major events is Steve Leibowitz, host of ILTV's Insider. Hi, Steve. Thanks for joining.
Sudan.
So, what is the topic this week?
Well, clearly, and I called the name of this week's broadcast reasonableness. I know a tough word. We were discussing how many syllables it actually has. That's the subject. Obviously, it impacts everyone in the country. The Knesset was debating until midnight last night. They passed the first reading of this law that has sent the opposition back into the streets, blocking intersections all over the country and really making life miserable for everyone, both those in the streets and those the police that need to take care of it, and also others that aren't involved that need to get places.
Are you focusing on the reform on the show or the day of disruption?
We're focusing somewhat on that, but one of my guests is a very special guy that has never been interviewed, as far as I know, since he left the Prime Minister's office, and his name is Ari Harrow. He was the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff. He's got some interesting takes on Netanyahu, so some of it will deal with the protests and the new legislation, and some of it will deal with the legacy of the Prime Minister. Where is his legacy at, and what might this do to the legacy of the man?
Can you give us a sneak peek on what his take is on the topic?
Ari is still a supporter of Prime Minister Netanyahu. He has been, I think, his entire adult life since moving here from Los Angeles. He was a top guy in the Prime Minister's office. He's been one of the people closest to Netanyahu over these years. I think he's a true supporter. I will say that he believes that Netanyahu is looking for compromise. So exactly what kind of compromise that is, you'll have to tune in to see.
Mm-hmm. Okay, is there any other topic that we're covering on this week's
Well, Amos Asael will be our second guest. He has certainly been a tough critic on Netanyahu, and I think what Amos says that's very interesting is that Amos, who is a supporter of the protests, says that there are limits to what the protesters should be allowed to do by law enforcement. In other words, he's warning the protesters themselves, don't step over certain red lines that Israeli society will not accept.
Steve Leibowitz, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Sivan, and welcome to ILTV.
Thank you. And now joining us with more on the legal reform and the day of disruption is JNS Jerusalem Bureau Chief Alex Tryman.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Alex. Thank you for joining us. The bill has passed its first reading, but still has a long way to go to become a law. What are we likely to see moving forward in regards to this legislation?
Well, I think that the coalition is intent on passing the legislation, and the opposition is intent on preventing the legislation from passing. The opposition doesn't have the votes to prevent it in the parliament, so they are taking to the streets. And as you stated earlier in the show, have been promising a day of disruption today, and probably will try to continue to shut down the country, the roads, the airports, and other critical infrastructure to try to get Netanyahu to pull the legislation back and to re-enter into negotiations over a compromise reform, negotiations that actually were broken off by the opposition.
Now, the reasonableness standard bill is only a small part of the reform. There were near compromises on this, and some of the opposition leaders have in the past themselves called for this particular part of the reform. Now, this begs the questions, where are the opposition leaders now, and why are they not calming the waters?
Exactly. As you mentioned earlier, there was a much wider bill, which included changes to the Judicial Selection Committee, limits to the Attorney General and ministry's legal advisors, and also a very controversial override clause, which would have given the Knesset the opportunity to overturn a Supreme Court ruling with a simple majority. This override clause was probably the straw that broke the camel's back for most protesters, and is what gave the middle of the country the sense that the government had gone too far, and led to the mass protests that we had back at the end of March. And that actually forced Netanyahu to pull the wider bill off the table. Negotiations were started under the leadership of Israel's president, Isaac Herzog, at his residence. But it was actually the opposition which broke off the negotiations, and you're starting to get the sense that it's the opposition that is actually failing the test of reasonableness here, because reasonableness is only one of the proposed reforms, and it's probably one of the most agreeable components of the reform, and the coalition knows that. And this is kind of the test that the coalition has given the opposition to see, who supports a compromise here and who doesn't, because a limited bill like the one just over reasonableness is actually a tremendous compromise on the part of the coalition, which has the seats and the votes that it needs to pass a very broad-based reform if it wanted to.
So speaking of the coalition, why are they stomping forward with this reform without the widespread consensus? They surely are aware that this would spark protests, massive protests.
Well, I think there's a question as to how massive these protests are going to be. Certainly the media and the opposition are hoping that there will be a large-scale protest. Just several nights ago, there was a very small number of protesters that were lighting bonfires on Israel's Tel Aviv's main Ayalon highway, but much of the media reporting that the protests were almost as large as the protests that we had in March, despite the fact that the protests were not even a 20th of the size of those major protests back in March. So it's going to be a real test to see how many people actually come out, and whether the issue of reasonableness is enough to garner the support of the center of the country, or just the further left of the Israeli electorate that is probably unwilling to compromise over any part of judicial reform whatsoever.
And what about the negotiations at the president's residence? Is there still hope for a wide-reaching compromise?
I think that there is still hope for a wide-reaching compromise. At the same time, I don't think that there's any hope for negotiations unless the coalition demonstrates that it is intent on passing judicial reform without negotiations at the president's residence. Right now, the opposition has very little incentive to reach a negotiated compromise, and it's going to take some bullying on behalf of the coalition, a demonstration of a willingness to pass at least portions of the judicial reform in order to get the opposition back to the negotiating table. Now, remember, this bill passed only its first reading and needs to pass through 2 more readings, which can happen fairly quickly, but it's still a process that needs to take place. And so I do think that there is some hope that the two sides could let calmer feelings prevail and re-enter into negotiations at the president's residence.
Alex Tryman, thank you for your important input.
Thank you so much.
The Palestinian Authority has rejected the Israeli Security Cabinet's conditions for helping prevent the PA's economic demise. The Palestinian Authority rejection follows the Israeli Security Cabinet decision to take steps to prevent the collapse of the Palestinian Authority in Judea and Samaria, but set a list of conditions. Topping the list, Jerusalem insists that the Palestinians end legal and diplomatic efforts against Israel. PA Prime Minister Mohammed Shtayyeh vowed to continue those efforts. He also rejected the Israeli demand to stop payments made by the PA to the families of imprisoned Palestinian terrorists. Shtayyeh told the PA cabinet in Ramallah that the so-called Israeli gestures are rejected. He demanded that PA funds seized by Israel belong to the Palestinians and must be returned to them unconditionally and without blackmail. He went on to claim that Israel was spreading disinformation regarding its intention to prevent the collapse of the Palestinian Authority. The Security Cabinet in Israel did not elaborate on how it plans to prevent the collapse of the authority or what steps it would take in the event that the PA rejected its terms. The United Nations has relayed Israel's demand to remove a Hezbollah tent on the Israeli side of the Lebanese border on Har Dov. The Lebanese government presented a demand of its own, seeking control over the tiny village of Rajar, striding the border. ILTV's Steve Leibowitz reports.
Israel reportedly sent a direct message to Hezbollah terrorists threatening an armed confrontation if it did not remove the tents, and soon. Israel seeks a quiet resolution, and the U.S. has reportedly also been intervening in the matter. 2 tents manned by armed Hezbollah terrorists were discovered in early June on Israeli territory north of the internationally recognized border, the so-called Blue Line in the contested Mount Dov region, also known as Sheba Farms. 1 tent was removed following a UNIFIL commanders meeting in Beirut. The 2nd tent remains. There was no direct reply to the Israeli demand, only a demand from Beirut that Israel withdraw from what's called the Lebanese part of the town of Rajar that straddles the Israeli-Lebanese border. Rajar was part of the territory captured from Syria in 1967. Following the Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon in the year 2000, there was a demarcation of the Blue Line, and the village was split in 2, with the northern half coming officially under Lebanese control. Israel regained control of the entire village during the Second Lebanon War in 2006, and residents have repeatedly objected to the potential division of the village, annexation of its northern half to Lebanon.
And joining us now with more on the security situation is Itamar Marquez, founder and director of Palestinian Media Watch. Hi, Itamar. Thank you for coming in.
Hello. Good to be with you.
So first, let's address the Palestinian Authority. It is on the verge of a collapse and yet has rejected Israel's terms to salvage it. What can you tell us about this? Is it still possible to save the Palestinian Authority?
Well, first of all, I think the Palestinian Authority is exaggerating about its verge of collapse. It's complaining that it's having financial difficulties, but we just discovered, and we're about to release this to the press shortly, that the Palestinian Authority announced just a little while ago that they actually raised 25% more income this year than they did last year. So their claim that they're about to collapse financially and they need more money is really just a claim to squeeze the international donors and squeeze Israel. But they, in fact, financially are doing better than they were doing last year. On the other hand, there is a threat to the Palestinian Authority, not financial, but from their own people. Their own people are sick of them. They've been corrupt for so many years. I would say probably 6 or 7 years now. Polls have found that close to 80% of Palestinians feel that Mahmoud Abbas and his government is corrupt. So they've had it with the PA. And there's one other final reason why they might collapse. The PA, since its inception, and we at Palestinian Media Watch have been warning about this for so long, they have been promoting terror. They have been teaching young children, adults, everyone that they have a right to, they call it armed conflict. We have a right to armed conflict. Every terrorist, even if they kill a child, gets a reward if they go to jail, gets payment if they go to jail. Terror has been on such a pedestal that the 15 to 25-year-olds today, the 15 to 30-year-olds today, absolutely were convinced by the PA that the only way to go is terror. Now, the Palestinian Authority is in a bind. They have been so successful in their hate education that the people aren't even listening to them anymore. And they now want the PA to be even more extreme than it has been. And that's the real threat to them now. All the people who they educated We talk about, training artificial intelligence and artificial intelligence turning on its programmers. Well, that's what's happened here. Mahmoud Abbas was the programmer of the Palestinian Authority youth. The Palestinian Authority programmed them to hate and terror, and now they are turning on the leadership because they are not extreme enough for them.
Mm-hmm. Now, the Israeli counter-terror operation in Jenin, it really shone a spotlight on the PA's weakness. What is the situation with the Palestinian Authority? What does it need to do now to stay relevant?
You chose a very good word. The Palestinian Authority isn't really relevant today to the people. And like I say, it was because of the success of the hate education. How can they win back the trust? I don't believe this leadership of the Palestinian Authority will ever be able to win back the trust. If they really, really want to win back the trust of the people, what they have to do is find leadership that is 10, 15, 20, 30 years younger than them, appoint these people very quickly into positions of significance, to be positions of ministers. Mahmoud Abbas himself has to resign, which over 70% of Palestinians have been demanding for years. And then they have to announce that they'll have elections within 3 months and pick a date and stick with it. So one, new leadership that the people can identify with, and two, have elections to prove that they really aren't a dictatorship like they've been until today. And then there is a chance that the people will say, okay, then the PA will become a representative of the Palestinian people, and then we will be able to support them. Then PA can survive.
Now, speaking of Abbas, he recently announced the PA would halt cooperation with Israel. Is this still ongoing?
Mahmoud Abbas has been announcing that he's halting cooperation with Israel for years, threatening it for even longer. And the reason why he won't is because without security cooperation, Hamas would take over in Judea and Samaria the same way they did in the Gaza Strip. The people don't like Abbas if you remember, just 2.5 years ago, the elections were scheduled, and Abbas canceled the elections at the last moment because he realized Hamas was going to win in both the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. Recently, there were 2 universities that had elections in the West Bank, Berzeit and Najah. In both of those elections, student for student council, Hamas has won. So Hamas is stronger in the West Bank. And Hamas will not hesitate to use military means to overthrow Abbas, who they say is illegitimate. Therefore, Mahmoud Abbas will never, ever stop security cooperation because he needs it in order to survive.
And the day after Abbas, do we see an heir somewhere down the line? Is it likely that Hamas or another Iranian-backed terror organization will take over?
Well, again, it depends on how smart Abbas is. And if he finds some people within the Fatah movement, hopefully someone who's actually moderate, who could be a leader that the people could get behind. Right now, we don't see him priming anyone like that. All of the people around him are as extremist as him and promote terror like him and support rewarding terrorists. His number 2 in Fatah is Mahmoud Al-Alul, and he, a former terrorist, and he's constantly glorifying terrorists. So these are the people around him. So the people who he has close to him, there is no one who can take over.
Itamar Marquez, thank you very much for the important input. Israel is the startup nation and is a global leader in many fields: cyber tech, drones, climate tech, and also food tech, to name a few. ILTV's William Sharon recently attended a first-of-its-kind summit held here in Israel, featuring the latest Israeli innovation that helps promote food security.
Despite having a small population, Israel has a huge impact on the world. This is especially true with regards to the agri-tech sector. Having developed a wide range of revolutionary agriculture and food security technology, ILTV had the opportunity to participate in a first-of-its-kind multidisciplinary summit, an international accelerator supported by the Israel Innovation Authority for Food, Agriculture, and Biotechnology Industries that promotes food security from innovation to action.
Investment in food tech has grown more than 3 times fold in the past 5 years, much of it in alternative proteins. Israel Innovation Authority has already invested over $70 million in different food tech companies. We're very proud to see many of these companies here in these booths already starting to demonstrate their products, and they have been manufacturing it here in Israel. Our vision for the Israel Innovation Authority is to be the world-leading innovation hub in food tech to combat climate crisis and food security for the world.
The summit showcased some of the leading Israeli tech companies making an impact in the field of food security.
Along the last 4 years, we've been supported by the Israeli Innovation Authority. We in BioBetter use tobacco plants as a green factory to produce recombinant proteins. We can actually produce any protein that you can imagine in these tobacco leaves.
When we started, it was really at the beginning hard to get all the money that we needed in order to start and to have the right people, and the IIA definitely helped us at the beginning. They gave us the first push in order to start. We are producing fresh gelato, yogurt, and sorbet, which is all natural ingredients, no artificial flavoring or anything like that. And the machine is only connected to electricity, nothing connected to water or milk or anything like that, so you just plug and play.
We are an incubator company supported by the Israeli Innovation Authorities, and we develop herbal medicine compositions that are focusing on specific medical conditions. In order to be part of the diet, we integrate those compositions into foods. So instead of taking medicine, instead of count on pills, you are eating the right food for yourself.
The summit also showcased a unique inventor, the Kitchen Food Tech Hub, founded by the Strauss Group, an Israeli company that plays a leading role in global food market and part of the Israeli Innovation Authority Tech's Incubator Program.
We just built now our innovation lab in Rehovot. So it's the first share space innovation lab that will be for our startups. It's going to contain capabilities from fermentation to cell cultivation, downstream equipment, and also an application lab. So the startup can invest their time in research and development, and we will supply with the Israeli Innovation Authorities that support us the capex for doing it.
The mission of the summit is to strengthen world security worldwide, based on coordinated strategic action and knowledge sharing. So what does the future hold?
Looking for the future, I think it's all about tikkun olam, okay? It's all about how we live a better world for our kids, and it's all about food security. It's about health, availability, affordability of food, okay? And doing it while creating less impact on sustainability of the planet.
Let's take a look at the weather forecast. Clear skies are expected around most of the country tonight, with lows of around 22 degrees Celsius or 72 Fahrenheit. Then tomorrow we will see more clear skies alongside steady top temperatures, seeing highs of about 33 Celsius or 92 degrees Fahrenheit. That's all for today's news. For more updates from Israel on all your devices, check out our ILTV channels, subscribe to our ILTV newsletter, and don't forget to check out our new and improved website, ILTV.tv, with all of the latest news from the heart of the State of Israel. I'm Sivan Raviv. Take care, and thank you so much for watching.